Hello and welcome to Just Draw, Just Paint, Part 18. I'm Gabriel, and today I want to show you guys how to use just one color to complete an entire painting with just a little bit of tweaking. So let's get started. So here we are. We have an isolated graveyard on a steamy lake or mangrove surrounded by a thick forest that has glowing butterflies. Okay, so that's our brief, and you can see I'm getting stuck in, as usual, just drawing out some thumbnails. And at this early stage of the painting, if you guys are not familiar with my process, I like to keep it extremely loose and just figure out a basic composition. So all of these compositions right now, because it's isolated on a little isolated graveyard, I wanted to position that graveyard more or less in the center of the painting, which sometimes is a design no-no. But in this case here, I actually like a center composition. And so we're just going to affect it by balancing either side of the image. And you'll notice that I dropped in some humans for scale before I did all my details. And I do that very, very typically with my landscapes because otherwise I have no idea how big something is supposed to be in the foreground, in the middle ground, in the background. And so it just gives me a point of reference to know how big my gravestones have to be, how big a rock is going to be, a coffin, some wood, anything in my scene that has real world scale, that we'll recognize as real world scale, has to be controlled by that initial human scale going backwards. So if I ever or never use humans, right, at least I have that layer that I can turn off and on to get my scale correct. So here I'm just isolating out my ideas. You can see I've worked up a middle ground, a background, and this interesting foreground that is sort of like a bridge that leads into a water pool. I wanted the feel of this composition to feel like the isolated graveyard is quite literally isolated. It's sort of, surrounded by a moat. And we don't know how dangerous or deep that moat is. I wanted to make it very murky, and I wanted it to reflect the background. And so I also kind of introduced a few hints, like there's broken up pieces of bridge to show that this descending foreground is actually getting lost into the water. So I just raised my composition there a little bit. And what I want to try do is just manipulate the foreground a little bit away from that island. And right now, the island is actually just one piece, but pretty soon, as we start the painting process, you'll see that as I'm laying in my colors here, pretty soon I will start to isolate that island, and I'm going to actually create a couple sections to it, just to kind of create a little bit more variety. Otherwise, it runs the danger of being a bit boring, something we've seen before, which is just a normal island. I like to spice things up a little bit and make it a little bit different. In that case, I'm going to make it a part of two little separate islands that are joined in the middle that we can't see from this point of view. So here I've laid in my basic values. This is what I do early in the process, and you can see I am just using one color, green, right, in this case. So here's an interesting point. If you guys go to the website coolers.com or Adobe Color, you can take any image and you can drop that image in there and sample from it and create a color palette. In this case here, I took a very green swampy image that I really liked, and I sampled all the colors out of it. And you can see those sampled colors on the left-hand side of my painting here with the color codes attached to them. So I can just sample those as I paint here, and I can just darken them and adjust their value. But most important thing here is I need to get my local values in and also my local colors, right? So I'm being very picky and choosy. And one of the things you're going to notice when you simplify your color process as opposed to complicate it is that you're going to realize that the only thing that makes a painting is actually the values, right? If you haven't got good values, your painting is left very, very naked. But if you have great values and you just use a few colors, you can get away with a lot. So for those of you who really, really struggle with color theory or using color in general, you can see it's not actually that complicated. You just have to have the right value for the right thing. Now, with that being said, I do want you to pay close attention here. I'm using a lighter value for the ground and a darker value for the wood. And the same is true for the stone, and the same is true for the sarcophagus on the left-hand side. So all of that is on purpose. Okay, number one, we have a foreground element here that we cannot ignore. This foreground is very close to camera. So I'm pouring all my detail and all my attention, all my paint time I'm spending here in this zone. And I experimented with a couple trees here to see if I could get it more interesting. But at the end of the day, I didn't have time for this painting. So I just kind of finished it up and took it to a place where I felt like it could work. Perhaps later on, I'll come back to it and revisit it. But who knows, right? Probably not, let's be honest. So got most of my elements here in the foreground. And what I still need to do is obviously finish with this tree that I keep fiddling, and then work up some of this slight middle ground here. So this area here is kind of leaking into the middle ground, and we'll start to separate those values a little bit here to kind of push it a little bit further backwards. And I need to establish some serious focal point on this island, right? It's a very important part of our composition. So this is another area that I'm going to spend a huge majority of my time painting up and making it look good. So that's really one of the tricks to painting, right? If you're painting anything, you have to ask yourself, what is the most important thing about the painting? And then lean into that importance by backing it up. You'll also notice that anything that is dark, like the silhouette of these gravestones, since I want the light to come from behind top left, I have to use a lighter value behind them, not only as atmospheric is getting thicker behind this initial island, but also as I am distinguishing, say, for example, the rocks from the ground in the foreground. It's the same concept, right? So as long as you're getting one value to read off another value as you lay it down and as you paint, your painting will start to come together in a logical way, right? It will start to look believable. So here, just working up this this sort of mid-ground here, we can call it the most important thing. And you'll notice that with this painting technique, when I turn off my lines, there's a lot of empty space, right? Because I had no background laid in terms of color, just a few gradients for the sky, I have empty spaces and little artifacts everywhere, all that kind of stuff. For me personally, I like to clean that up later on. I don't like to be preoccupied with making it important at this stage. Sometimes, it's very rare, but sometimes those little artifacts can add character to a painting. And it's very similar to traditional media. Traditional media will often do an underpainting and then paint on top of it and leave little pieces of it showing through, whether it's color, whether it's a happy accident. And sometimes that adds character to the painting. It makes it look traditional, right? It's not really what we're after here. Of course, this is going to look pretty digital when I'm done. But here you can see I'm starting to clean up, right? I've removed a lot of that negative white space. And now I'm painting in the reflections, right? Very important to get those reflections in the background looking good. So one of the fundamentals that I teach at my school is how to control reflections. Of course, it's a whole science on its own. You have to know where something reflects, at what angle and why. There's names and terms for all of these things. But here I'm actually using it, right? I often say to my students, you'll hardly ever use reflections in your painting. But when you do, you need that knowledge, right? And this is a really good example of when I use that knowledge to my own benefit, right? Especially, by the way, in the absolute foreground of this little lake here, this little mangrove water, because the closer it gets to my feet, the less reflective it becomes, right? And there's a good reason for that. It's a whole scientific principle. But because I know that, I can now inject more reflection in there, right? And you can see it fades out, and now I can start to add foreground details to the water. So here I'm just going to increase the complexity of the painting by showing you layer upon layer. So we're just including all the little things that I've painted and save time not recording, right? Because otherwise it would take way too long to show you guys. But you can see step by step, I get my butterflies in. I've got little bits of steam, right? Because this is supposed to be a isolated steamy lake, right? And you can see little bits of steam coming up and surrounding this area. And the steam is excellent because it actually silhouettes some of the forms in my painting. And that's another great reason to include it. So here I'm adding some more shrubbery, some more branches. And finally, we're going to start adding in the ghosts, right? Which I really wanted into that midground to sell the story of this place. So that's it for me. I'm going to jump to the final right now. And I hope you guys enjoyed this little mini tutorial. I hope it was interesting to you. And I hope you learned that with just one color and a little bit of tweaking, you can get very, very far into a painting process. So there you have it. And I guess I'll see you next time.